Parmenides was an early Greek philosopher who flourished sometime between the late 6th and mid 5th centuries BCE. He lived in the city of Elea, a Greek colony on the Italian peninsula, which would come to be the namesake of the early Western tradition of Greek philosophy, called the Eleatic School. He wrote a single work, a poem, which comes down to us with the name On Nature, although this may well have been a name later ascribed to the text by other authors. The poem has come down to us incomplete, and is mostly preserved by the Neoplatonist Simplicus, who quoted extensively from the poem, stating that even in his day the poem was rare. In this video, I will quote from the fragments as numbered in the form of John Burnet's book, Early Greek Philosophy. I should note that in areas I have been a little liberal with the original translations, which were somewhat archaic in their phrasing, but by comparing several translations, I believe that this preserves the original meaning while at the same time being more comprehensible to the modern audience. The poem begins with a proem, which is a preface or preamble to a book or speech. In this proem, Parmenides describes a figurative journey he once took to the abode of the goddess, taken in a chariot by the mythic daughters of Helios into the halls of the goddess of night and day, and the goddess that he greets there is Night herself. Night welcomes Parmenides in the fragment 1, lines 24 to 26. Welcome, fair youth, that comes to my abode on a cart, tended by immortal charioteers. It is no bad luck, but right and justice that has brought you here today, for far indeed it lies from the beaten track of men. The appearance of Night may, or may not, be linked with the Orphic mystery religion's description of Night as the counselor of Zeus, who tells him how to preserve the unity produced by him absorbing the universe in preparation for the creation of a new cosmological cycle. As such, it could be that Parmenides is presenting himself as an initiate into a mystery religion, about to receive enlightenment concerning the fundamental unity of the universe. However, this is very much speculation based on the fact that we don't know a huge amount about the mystery religions, particularly within Parmenides' day and age. Night then goes on to foreshadow the rest of the poem in fragment 1, lines 26 to 32. You must learn all things, both the unshaken heart of well-rounded truth and the opinions of mortals, in which is no true belief at all. Nonetheless, these things too you will learn, how what they resolve has actually to be all through all-pervading. Here she will firstly dictate the true nature of all things, which is covered in the first section following the proem and is called the way of truth. However, this will be at odds with the false understandings and intuitions of the masses of humanity, which is covered in the second section and called the way of belief. This division is again highlighted when Night gives warning of the seemingly contradictory nature of the revelation which will come in the rest of the poem, in fragment 1, lines 33 to 36 saying, "But you must restrain yourself from this way of inquiry, nor let habit by its much experience force thee to cast upon this way a wandering eye, or sounding ear, or tongue, but judge by argument the much disputed proof uttered by me. There is only one way left that can be spoken of." The poem, following this introductory outline, then moves into the section called the Way of Truth, where Parmenides explores the nature of reality. Night tells the young Parmenides that there is two routes of inquiry which can be taken to find true reality. The first method, which the goddess wholeheartedly commends, is by recognizing that what is, as shown in fragment 4 and 5, lines 2 to 3. The first, namely, that it is, and that it is impossible for it not to be, is the way of belief, for truth is its companion. The second way, which is rejected, is by using that which is not, as seen in fragment 4 and 5, lines 3 to 6. The other, namely, that it is not, and that it is must needs not be, that I tell you is a path that none can learn of at all. For you cannot know what is not, that is impossible, nor utter it, for it is the same thing that can be thought and that can be. It would appear by forbidding the youth from using the idea of negation that Parmenides is putting forward an argument for the impossibility of nothingness. This is best exemplified in fragment 6, lines 1 and 2. It needs must be that what can be spoken and thought is, for it is possible for it to be, and it is not possible for what is nothing to be. If we then accept Parmenides' argument that nothingness, or the void, is impossible, he argues that what is must be a single whole, as in fragment 8, lines 3 to 5. Nor was it ever, nor will it be, for now it is, all at once, a continuous one. For what kind of origin for it will you look for? In what way and from what source could it have drawn its increase? And furthermore, he argues that this whole must be uncreated, because it is impossible for that which is to have either emerged from nothingness or returned to nothingness to exist, as seen in fragments 8, line 19 to 22. How then can what is be going to be in the future, or how could it come into being? If it came into being, it is not, nor is it if it is going to be in the future. Thus is becoming extinguished and passing away not to be heard of. Knight then goes on to prove to the young Parmenides that reality is not only timeless and whole, but also indivisible, as per fragment 8, lines 23 and 25. Nor is it divisible, since it is all alike, and there is no more of it in any one place than in another, to hinder it from holding together, nor less of it, but everything is full of what it is. Therefore, it is wholly continuous, for what is in contact with what is. Being a whole, timeless, and indivisible, Parmenides believes that reality must be fundamentally unmoving, but also limited in its expanse, as per fragment 8, lines 26 to 33. Moreover, it is immovable in the bonds of mighty chains, without beginning and without end, since coming into being and passing away have been driven afar, and true belief has cast them away. It is the same, and it rests in the self-same place, abiding in itself, and thus it remains constant in its place, for hard necessity keeps it in the bonds of the limit that holds it fast on every side. Therefore, it is not permitted for what it is to be infinite, for it is in need of nothing, while, if it were infinite, it would stand in need of everything. Thus, what does the reality of Parmenides consist in? As per fragment 8, lines 1 to 3, one path only is left for us to speak of, namely, that it is. In this path are very many tokens that what is uncreated and indestructible, for it is complete, immovable, and without end. However, this description of reality appears to contradict the everyday experience of the senses. Parmenides accepts that there must be a reality behind the everyday experience of humans, but is dismissive of mortal empirical accounts of reality, which is shown in fragment 8, lines 34 to 41. The thing that can be thought and that for the sake of which the thought exists is the same, for you cannot find thought without something that is, as to which it is uttered, and there is not, and never shall be, anything besides what is, since fate has chained it so as to be whole and immovable. Therefore, all these things are but names which mortals have given, believing them to be true, coming into being and passing away, being and not being, change of place and alteration of bright colour. Instead, he, through the mouthpiece of Knight, posits an alternative view of ultimate reality in line with his doctrine of the immovable, limited and whole one, in fragment 8, lines 44 to 49. Since, then, it has a furthest limit, it is complete on every side, like the mass of a rounded sphere, equally poised from the centre in every direction, for it cannot be greater or smaller in one place than in another, for there is nothing that could keep it from reaching out equally, nor can that which is be more here and less there than what is, since it is all inviolable. For the point from which it is equal in every direction tends equally to the limits. The final section of the poem, The Way of Belief, appears to be a cosmological explanation of the evolution of the world as we experience and an account for the motion and change which we experience that has been rendered impossible by the deliberations in the way of the truth. There is considerably less material which has survived from this section, which, according to some scholarly accounts, may only survive in 1/10 of its original length. However, what appears to come from the fragments and commentary on this section of the poem is that this section posited that there was two basic principles of the cosmos, as light and night, and then went on to detail how these principles led to the origin, nature, and behavior of the heavens and celestial bodies, including the stars, sun, moon, the Milky Way, and the Earth itself. From this macro view, the poem then zoomed in to give an account of the inhabitants of the Earth, the generation of humans, and possibly even the nature of cognition. A taste of what was included in this section is seen in fragment 10. You will know the ether's nature, and in the ether all the signs and the unseen works of the pure torch, of the brilliant sun, and from whence they came to be, and you will learn the wandering works of the round-eyed moon, and its nature, and you will know too the surrounding heaven, both whence it grew, and how necessity directing it bound it to furnish the limits of the stars. And, fragment 11, how the earth and the sun and the moon, and the shared ether, and the heavenly milk, and Olympus, outermost, and the hot might of the stars began to come to be. However, the issue that arises from these rather contradictory components of the poem is how does one round the square when it comes to marrying the metaphysical arguments for the one in the way of the truth and the complex cosmological arguments in the way of belief. One interpretation, common in antiquity and often the most intuitive to those first encountering the poem, is the monistic one described in the way of truth is actual reality, while the complex and shifting cosmology of the way of belief is simply an error of mortals caused by naming that is, providing definitive descriptions and predications about the subject of reality. As a result, mortals have described reality as an oppositional duality of two forms, light and night, instead of the unmoving whole which it truly is. This is often called the strict monist view, in the conception of the monistic cosmos being superior to the worthless opinion of the many. Although this is the most pervasive interpretation, many reject the position as too counterintuitive, and also begging the question, why would Parmenides even write a second part to the poem if he already believes it to be false? The second potential interpretation is that the way of truth and the way of belief are actually two ways of looking at the same reality, like two separate views of a statue. In this interpretation, although the way of truth may be closer to true reality, the way of belief also holds an aspect of truth and accounts for our lived experience. Thus, this position has been called the aspectual interpretation, as we see reality from different aspects. However, the problem with this argument is that it appears to be Platonizing Parmenides, in backcasting anachronistically Plato's conception of the forms onto Parmenides' poem. A third interpretation that has been argued is that Parmenides, in discussing the oneness of being, is not referring to the totality of existence, but instead talking about the fundamental entities which remain eternal, motionless, and unified, and to which the plurality of existence refers, both in terms of language that we use in day-to-day speech and the reality we encounter on a day-to-day basis. Here the interpreters argue that Parmenides is making an argument about essence in the way of truth, and then in the way of the opinion, he is describing a system of cosmology which is dependent on this concept of essence. As such, this view has been called the essentialist interpretation. However, once again, this faces the charge of potential anachronism, falling even closer to Plato's theory of forms than the aspectual position. Furthermore, there is no clear evidence in the remaining fragments that ties Parmenides to any such metaphysical argument. A final interpretation can in some ways be seen as a development from or subset of the essentialist view. This is the position that Parmenides, in The Way and the Truth, is attempting to describe the essential properties of some kind of being, as per the essentialist view. However, the difference in this fourth interpretation is the kind of being described, rather than an account of what any fundamental entity must be like. This interpretation argues that Parmenides is making an argument as to what any necessary being must necessarily be like, as being a necessary being. In this interpretation, humans, who are contingent rather than necessary beings, make the mistake of thinking the contingent world they perceive through their senses is the only thing that exists. However, if we are to use our rationality and conceive of necessary rather than contingent beings, at least according to the dictates of Parmenides' thought, we would logically arrive at the conclusion that a necessary being is a discrete entity which must possess its modal nature uniformly throughout. By modal here, we mean relating to the mode or form as opposed to the substance, and as such, this position has been labelled the modal interpretation. Again, however, this position, drawn from the same basic assumptions as the essentialist view, falls afoul of the arguments of anachronism and lack of evidence. Although all authors invite discussion and interpretation, the difficulty of Parmenides' poem is exacerbated by the cryptic nature of Parmenides' prose and the fragmentary nature of the surviving text. In my own estimation, the strict monist interpretation of Parmenides' argument seems to square most neatly with the surviving text. Although this may seem to be contradictory to the modern ear, it doesn't ask anything more ridiculous than other contemporary mythopoetic accounts of reality, and perhaps our own puzzlement is merely an outgrowth of our own modern states of mind, which find it difficult to accept such a conflicting metaphysical position. However, regardless of our interpretation, this poem earned Parmenides the reputation as the first great metaphysical thinker in the Greek tradition. His ideas were influential both in the establishment of the Eleatic school and in the arguments of the pluralists against the atomists. Finally, Parmenides clearly had an impact on the philosophy and thought of Plato, as seen in his dialogue named Parmenides after the great thinker. As such, we should see Parmenides' importance not just in his own work, but in the way that he shaped early Greek philosophy and thus influenced Western philosophy down to this day.